They say heroes come in all shapes and sizes, but no one expected this hero. A stray dog, thin, limping, and barely surviving on the streets, did something that left an entire police department speechless. When a police officer was trapped in a life-or-death situation, this dog risked everything to save him. And what happened next? No one saw it coming. We're about to dive into an unexpected bond that formed in the middle of chaos. A routine patrol gone wrong, a police officer trapped in a life-or-death situation, and a stray dog with nothing to lose, who risked everything to save a complete stranger. This emotional journey will leave you breathless and remind you that heroes can come from the most unlikely places. Stick around till the end, because what happens next will truly shock you. It started like any other quiet evening shift. The sun was just beginning to dip below the rooftops, casting a soft orange hue across the horizon. Birds were retreating to their nests, and most of the city was settling in for the night. Officer Mark Thompson sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, the faint hum of the engine, the only sound keeping him company. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, glancing at the dashboard clock. 6:42 p.m. He had been on duty for almost 4 hours, and so far, everything had been calm. Too calm, actually. The outskirts of the city were rarely busy at this hour. There were no speeding drivers, no loud disputes, no suspicious characters loitering on street corners. Just silence. For some officers, that would have been a blessing. But for Mark, it stirred something uneasy in his gut. Maybe it was just experience. After 12 years on the force, Mark had developed a kind of sixth sense, an internal alarm that buzzed not when things were loud or chaotic, but when they were still. Stillness, in his experience, often came before a storm. He rolled through a nearly empty street lined with small auto shops and chain-link fences. Most of the businesses had already closed for the day, the metal shutters pulled down and padlocked. Mark scanned the area slowly. Nothing seemed out of place. He reached for his coffee, now lukewarm in the cup holder, and took a sip. He was about to turn the vehicle around and head back toward the main road when something caught his eye. A flicker of movement down a narrow side street. At first, it was subtle, just a blur, but it was enough to make him pause. Mark turned down the alleyway, the tires of his cruiser crunching over gravel and broken glass. As he moved closer, the outline of an old warehouse came into view. It sat behind a sagging chain-link fence, surrounded by weeds as tall as a man's waist. The structure looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Roof rusting, bricks cracking, windows broken out. It was the kind of place kids might sneak into for dares, or the kind of place criminals used when they didn't want to be found. Mark narrowed his eyes. According to the precinct records, this warehouse had been condemned over a year ago after a fire damaged the inside. No utilities, no permits, definitely not supposed to be in use. So why had he seen movement? He parked the car a short distance away, stepped out, and quietly closed the door behind him. His hand instinctively went to his utility belt as he scanned the area. At first glance, the building appeared empty, but that's when he saw it, just at the edge of the tall grass, half hidden by a rusted oil drum. A dog. Skin clung tightly to its ribs, and its fur was thick with dirt. One paw was lifted slightly off the ground, as if injured, and its head was low, watching him silently. It didn't bark, didn't growl, just stared. Stray dogs weren't uncommon in these parts, but something about this one was different. The way it didn't flinch when he approached, the way it didn't run, the way its eyes didn't just look at him, they studied him. Mark stopped about 15 feet away, not wanting to scare it off. "You okay there, buddy?" The dog didn't move. Its eyes didn't blink. It was unsettling and oddly familiar at the same time, like the animal had seen things, been through things, survived. Mark turned his focus back to the warehouse. If the dog had been lingering around here, maybe it had seen something, or someone, go inside, or maybe it was just a coincidence. Still, that buzzing in his gut hadn't gone away. He pulled his radio to his mouth. "Dispatch, this is Officer Thompson. I'm checking out the old Braxton warehouse off Klein Street. Looks like there might be movement inside. No backup needed for now. Just going to take a look." The radio crackled, and dispatch responded with a short, "Copy that, Officer Thompson. Proceed with caution." Mark clipped the radio back on and unlatched the gate. It gave a metallic groan as he stepped through, weeds brushing against his legs. The air smelled like rust and mildew, thick with the scent of something that had been rotting for far too long. The dog followed, silently, carefully, like it knew something was about to happen. Mark glanced back. "You're not afraid, are you?" Still no bark, no whine, just quiet footsteps in the grass. He reached the warehouse's side door, barely hanging on its hinges, It swung inward with a slow creak, revealing a hallway blanketed in darkness. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick air like a sword. Dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he stepped inside. Behind him, the dog stopped at the doorway but didn't enter. Mark gave one last look over his shoulder before heading deeper into the building. Something about the silence inside the warehouse was wrong. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the heavy kind. The kind that presses on your chest. The kind that hides things. His light swept across broken desks, fallen ceiling panels, and walls stained with black soot from the fire that had gutted it last year. No sign of anyone. Yet that feeling, that tightening in his chest, kept getting stronger. He was about to move into the next room when he heard it. A soft shuffle, barely audible, but it was there. He froze. The noise came again, this time from the room to his left. Mark turned the beam of light toward it, his heart beginning to race. Then silence. Mark edged closer to the room where the noise had come from. He kept his flashlight steady in one hand, his other hand resting near his holstered weapon. The crunch of broken glass beneath his boots sounded unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. Another creak, this time louder. Someone, or something, was definitely in there. He took a slow breath, then carefully stepped through the doorway. The room was pitch black except for where his flashlight beam landed. It looked like it had once been an office, maybe the foreman's. A metal desk lay overturned in the center, drawers hanging out, papers scattered and yellowed with age. In the corner was a pile of discarded tarps and tools. Everything was coated in a fine layer of soot. Mark moved forward cautiously, sweeping the light across the space. Nothing. He exhaled through his nose, his body still tense. Maybe it had been an animal, a rat, or even the wind through the broken windows. This place was a decaying shell. It could make all kinds of noises. Then bang. Something slammed upstairs. Not a creak, not a shuffle, a bang. Mark's heart jumped. He swung his flashlight upward toward the ceiling, his eyes narrowing. There shouldn't be anyone here. He radioed again. Dispatch. I'm hearing movement inside the Braxton warehouse. Requesting backup. Copy that. The voice replied. Nearest unit is 10 minutes out. 10 minutes. A lot can happen in 10 minutes. Mark looked back toward the door. The dog was gone. For a moment, he felt a strange unease. He didn't realize until now how oddly comforting the stray's presence had been. The way it had watched from the weeds, followed him quietly, like it knew what was coming. Mark climbed the old staircase carefully. Every step groaned beneath his weight. The second floor was darker, colder. The air smelled of burnt wood and something else, something chemical. He reached the top, his flashlight cutting across collapsed ceiling beams and broken crates. And then he saw them. Footprints, fresh, clear, leading down the hall. They weren't boot prints like his. They looked like sneakers, and judging by the spacing, whoever left them had been moving fast. Mark followed, slow and steady, flashlight tracking every corner. He reached a closed door at the end of the hallway. The knob was smeared with something. It could have been grease, or maybe blood. Mark's pulse quickened. He reached for the handle. Crash! Something slammed into him from the side. He hit the floor hard, shoulder first, the flashlight flying out of his hand and rolling away. The beam spun wildly, flashing across broken walls and floors. He tried to get up, but the weight of another body was on him. A figure in a dark hoodie, masked, strong. Mark struggled, arms grappling, knees trying to gain leverage. But the attacker was fast, too fast. A punch landed across Mark's face, dazing him. Another blow hit his ribs. He reached for his weapon, but it was kicked out of reach. Then, something sharp, the cold slice of metal dragged across his vest. Not deep, but enough to sting. He felt the panic rise in his chest. His breath came fast and shallow. He kicked upward, throwing the attacker off for a moment, just enough to crawl toward the flashlight. Another crash, this time from the staircase. Heavy footsteps, fast. Then, out of nowhere, a growl. Low, deep, furious. Mark turned his head just in time to see the stray dog, charging. The attacker barely had time to react before the dog was on him, teeth snapping, growling with a rage Mark didn't know animals could have. The man screamed, trying to push the dog off, but it was locked on, biting, clawing, refusing to let go. Mark scrambled to his knees, blood pounding in his ears. He reached for his weapon just as the attacker shoved the dog away and bolted down the hall. The dog stumbled but didn't stay down. It barked loud, urgent, and gave chase. Mark forced himself to stand, every muscle shaking. He followed the sounds, footsteps, barking, crashing through the halls, until he reached the broken stairwell again. By the time he got downstairs, It was quiet again, too quiet. No sign of the attacker, no sign of the dog, only his own ragged breathing and the sound of his heartbeat in his ears. Mark stood in the middle of the warehouse floor, catching his breath, every muscle tight, like a coiled spring. His flashlight flickered in and out, barely holding a charge now. He squinted through the dimness, scanning every shadow, every rustle of wind. But there was nothing, no dog, no attacker, just silence. Mark's radio crackled. Unit 12, backup's 3 minutes away. What's your status? He brought the mic to his mouth, hesitated, then said, suspect fled, possible injuries. I need a K9 unit or eyes on surrounding exits. Copy, sending a drone team as well. He didn't mention the dog. Something about it felt too strange to explain. A stray that had followed him and defended him, then vanished into thin air. He walked to the warehouse door and looked outside. The night air hit him like a splash of cold water. The overgrown lot was as empty as before. The stray was gone. Mark took a deep breath, then winced. His ribs ached. His shoulder was bruised. But it could have been much worse. If that dog hadn't shown up, he shook his head. It didn't make sense. Why would a street dog get involved in a fight like that? As backup arrived and began searching the building, Mark gave a basic report. Nothing fancy, no embellishments. He still didn't mention the dog. He wasn't sure he believed it himself. Mark didn't sleep well that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of the attacker, the sudden blur of movement, the impact, the growl, those teeth, and the dog's eyes. They weren't wild. They weren't rabid. They were focused, intentional, like it knew exactly what it was doing. He arrived at the precinct the next morning sore, but standing. The medics had checked him out. No major injuries, just bruises, and a nasty scrape on his arm from the floorboards. His partner, Officer Keegan, clapped him on the back. Dude, heard you almost got jumped by a ghost in there, Keegan joked, sipping his coffee. Mark gave a tired smile. Felt more like a freight train. Anything stolen? Nope. Any idea who it was? Nothing solid. No face. No prints. Just some scuffed up sneakers and a fast right hook. Keegan leaned in, lowering his voice. You ever figure out how you got out of there? Word is, you were pinned down. Mark hesitated. I had help. Help. He looked down. A dog. Keegan blinked. Like a K9. No, a stray. Keegan laughed, nearly spitting out his drink. You're telling me a stray mutt saved your butt? Mark didn't laugh. I'm serious. Keegan saw the look in his eyes and stopped smiling. You're not messing with me. No. Mark told him everything. How the dog was there before he entered. How it followed him in. How it attacked the guy and disappeared. Keegan stared at him. That's wild, man. I know. Think it was trained? I don't know. Didn't look trained. Looked like it hadn't eaten in days. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Keegan said, we should find that dog. Later that week, Mark tried not to let it haunt him, but it did. He returned to the warehouse. Not on duty, just curious. He walked the lot, searched nearby alleys, whistled low to the wind, hoping maybe, just maybe, that dog would show up again. Nothing. The weeds still swayed. The windows still creaked. But the dog was gone. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling. That night hadn't been random. The dog hadn't just stumbled in. It was like it had been waiting for him, waiting for that moment, waiting to act. He couldn't explain why, but something deeper stirred in him. Maybe it was guilt for not sticking around to find the dog. Maybe it was wonder. Or maybe it was something more personal, because he'd been a dog person all his life. He'd grown up with a golden retriever named Max, lost him at 16. Never got another one after that. Life got too busy, work got too dangerous, and honestly, he didn't want to get attached. But this dog, this ragged, limping, half-starved animal, had done something most people wouldn't have. It had saved his life. Mark knew he couldn't just move on. 3 days later, he was driving home from the station one night, headlights cutting through light rain, when something darted into the road. He slammed the brakes. There, in the middle of the lane, soaked and trembling, was the dog, the same one. Mark pulled over fast, heart hammering in his chest. He opened the door slowly and stepped out, squinting through the mist. The dog didn't run. It just stood there, tail low, soaked to the bone, limping slightly. Mark crouched, his voice gentle. Hey, remember me? The dog tilted its head, ears flicking. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a granola bar, the only food he had. He unwrapped it slowly and placed it on the ground. The dog sniffed the air, took a cautious step forward, then another. Mark held his breath. The dog took the food, devoured it in seconds, then looked up at him again. This time, it wagged its tail, just once, but it was enough. Mark took a slow step forward, careful not to startle the dog. He didn't reach out too fast. He didn't speak again. He just waited, and after a few tense seconds, the dog took a few steps toward him, close enough now that Mark could see its eyes clearly. There was recognition in them, not fear, not confusion, just quiet trust. The same kind of trust that had driven this stray into a crumbling warehouse to fight off a man twice its size. Mark crouched down again, keeping his hand low. "Let me help you," he said softly. The dog limped the rest of the way and nudged its head under Mark's hand. That was it. That one gesture, quiet and unspoken, carried more weight than 1,000 words. Mark opened the passenger door of his cruiser and gestured. The dog didn't hesitate. It jumped up, circled twice on the seat, and sat down. Mark shut the door gently, got in, and drove. He didn't take it to the shelter. He took it home. Mark cleaned the dog up that night, gave him a bath, let him eat until his belly rounded. It wasn't fancy food, just leftover chicken and rice, but the way that dog wolfed it down made it clear. He hadn't eaten a real meal in days, maybe weeks. Under all the grime and tangled fur, he wasn't as old as Mark had guessed. Young, actually, maybe 2 or 3 years tops. He had a rough look, scars near his shoulder, a torn ear, but his eyes were full of life. Mark didn't name him right away, didn't feel right. Not yet. They were still figuring each other out. The dog followed him around the house cautiously, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to stay, like he was used to being kicked out or ignored. But when Mark lay down on the couch later that night, the dog curled up right by his feet. That's when Mark knew he wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, Mark called in sick. Not something he did often, but he had a lot on his mind. He took the dog to a local vet, a friend from his academy days, who now ran a quiet clinic on the edge of town. The vet, Dr. Ramirez, raised an eyebrow when she saw the bruised-up, scruffy dog limping beside Mark. "Where'd you find this warrior?" she asked, crouching down to examine him. Mark gave her the short version. The warehouse, the attack, the rescue. She blinked. "You're telling me this stray saved your life? I know how it sounds." "No, I believe you," she said. "You just don't hear that every day." She gave the dog a full exam. Minor injuries, older scars, limp likely from an old sprain, not recent, malnourished but treatable. "He's a survivor," she said. "Been through a lot." Mark nodded, watching the dog lick her fingers. "Yeah, that's what I figured." Dr. Ramirez glanced at him. "You keeping him?" Mark didn't even hesitate. "Yeah, I am." A week went by. The dog, now named Shadow, was settling in well. He followed Mark everywhere, slept by the door, waited by the window when Mark left for work, didn't bark much, didn't beg, just watched, alert, quiet, protective. One night, Mark noticed something odd. While brushing out Shadow's fur, he found a thin patch on the underside of his neck. It wasn't just a scar. It looked like an old spot where a collar used to be. A real collar, one that had been there long enough to leave a mark. Mark frowned. Strays didn't usually have that kind of wear. Was Shadow really born on the streets, or had someone abandoned him? He grabbed a flashlight and checked the spot again, and that's when he saw it. Faint, almost invisible, but clearly there. A tattoo, not a decorative one, a coded number. Mark's stomach dropped. This was no ordinary dog. Shadow had been trained, and not just by anyone. That style of marking, it looked military, or police. Mark reached out to a buddy in the K9 division, sent him the photo of the tattoo. It took a day to get an answer. When it came, Mark just stared at the message on his phone. Shadow wasn't a stray. He was a former K9, certified, trained in apprehension and search and rescue. His original name had been Ghost, but 3 years ago, during a high-risk operation outside the state, he'd gone missing, thought to be killed in action after a drug raid turned violent. His handler had died in the line of duty, and Ghost had vanished in the chaos. No one expected to ever see him again, until now. Mark sat down, phone in hand, and looked across the room at the dog, at Shadow, or Ghost, or whatever name truly belonged to him. He wasn't just a dog who had wandered into danger. He was trained to run toward it, and when he saw Mark being attacked, his instincts kicked in, because that's what he was made to do. Protect, serve, even after being forgotten, even after losing everything. Mark didn't care what name was on the file. To him, he'd always be Shadow, because in his darkest moment, in a place no one else could reach in time, Shadow stepped in. No leash, no command, no obligation, just heart, and that was worth more than any badge or title. So Mark gave him what no one else had for years: safety, stability, a home, and Shadow gave him what no one else could: a second chance. Mark couldn't stop thinking about it. He sat at his kitchen table the next morning, sipping coffee that had gone cold, his eyes fixed on the silent figure lying on the living room rug. Shadow, A stray no more. A dog with a hidden past, a warrior that fate had somehow dropped at his feet. There was something almost eerie about it. Not in a bad way, just surreal. How had this dog, this lost, forgotten K9, ended up in that warehouse on that exact night, at that exact time? Had he been living in that part of town all along, hiding in the shadows, watching the world forget him? Or was it something more? Mark didn't know, but one thing was certain. Shadow was no ordinary dog, and the more time he spent with him, the more he realized just how deep that truth went. Shadow wasn't just smart. He was sharp, too sharp. Mark would leave his keys on the kitchen counter, and Shadow would nudge them toward the front door when it was time to leave. If Mark's phone buzzed with a loud alert, Shadow would rush to his side, scanning the room for threats. Once, when a neighbor's kid started screaming in the backyard, Shadow leapt over the fence without hesitation, thinking the child was in danger. He was wired for protection, every fiber of his being. Mark had seen trained K9s before, worked with them, trusted them, but this was something else. Shadow was operating on instinct, but also something deeper, loyalty, purpose, almost like, despite everything he'd been through, he was still on duty. A few days later, Mark drove back to the warehouse. He had to see it again, not out of curiosity, but because something didn't sit right. The guy who attacked him, who was he? Why was he there? And why did he run so fast after Shadow got involved? Mark didn't buy that it was just a random druggie or squatter. There was something calculated about how it all went down. Shadow sat in the passenger seat beside him, ears up, alert, tail thumping gently against the seat. They arrived just before sunset. The building looked worse in daylight. Crumbling brick, shattered glass, rusted beams that groaned in the wind. Mark stepped inside, flashlight in hand, Shadow close at his heel. The place had been partially cleaned out. No sign of the attacker, no fresh footprints, multiple sets. Someone had come back, and not just once. Mark knelt down, running his fingers over the prints. This wasn't just an accident. This place was being used, and whatever they were doing, it was bigger than he'd thought. Mark hadn't even stood up when Shadow suddenly stiffened beside him. The dog's ears snapped up, nose in the air. A low growl built in his chest. "Shadow," Mark whispered, rising slowly. The dog didn't bark. He moved, quiet, fast, toward the back of the warehouse. Mark followed. They slid down a hallway, past rusted shelves and broken crates, into a rear office that smelled of mildew and damp wood. That's when Mark saw it. A trapdoor, covered in dust, but recently disturbed. A smudge of mud, a print, a scratch mark from a boot, or something heavy being dragged. "Someone's using this," Mark muttered. He crouched, brushing debris off the edge of the door. Shadow stood beside him, tail stiff, muscles tense. Mark knew he shouldn't open it alone. He should call backup, but a part of him, the cop in him, the man who had nearly been killed just feet from the spot, refused to walk away. He opened the trapdoor, a stairwell, descending into darkness. They went down slowly. Mark kept his flashlight high, one hand resting near his holstered sidearm. Shadow led the way, careful, deliberate, silent. The staircase opened into a low-ceilinged room, and what Mark saw next nearly made his blood run cold. Maps, blueprints, stacks of cash, weapons. This wasn't just some hideout. It was a base of operations, an underground cell. A criminal ring had been operating under this abandoned building, hiding in plain sight, and Mark had stumbled right into the middle of it. The man who attacked him, he hadn't been some random drifter. He was guarding this. Mark stepped further in, taking pictures with his phone. Evidence, proof. Shadow moved ahead, sniffing around a stack of crates, and then he barked. Once, sharp. Mark turned, and that's when he saw the bag, a duffel. He opened it. Inside, photos. Photos of city officials, police officers. One of them was Mark. He stared in disbelief. They'd been tracking him. Why? What had he gotten too close to? How long had they been watching? Shadow growled again, this time deeper. Mark followed his gaze and saw the blinking red light. A camera. They were being watched. Mark didn't wait. He snapped the last few photos, grabbed the duffel, and turned. "Let's go, Shadow." They sprinted up the stairs. As they reached the surface, he heard it, tires screeching. Someone had arrived. Mark shoved the trapdoor closed and bolted for the cruiser. Two men appeared at the warehouse entrance, armed. They shouted something, but Mark didn't stop. Shadow leapt into the passenger seat as Mark gunned the engine. Bullets pinged off the side mirror as they sped away. He didn't look back. Not this time. Over the next 2 weeks, Mark turned over everything to internal affairs. The photos, the money, the map, the location. Shadow stayed by his side during every late-night interview, every tense conversation, An investigation launched. Quiet, undercover, the warehouse was cleaned out by the time authorities arrived, but the data Mark had collected was enough to start connecting dots. A dirty cop, a corrupted informant, a network Mark hadn't even known existed, and somehow, Shadow had known, had sensed it, had led him there. The pieces started to fit. Mark hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He'd been targeted, and without Shadow, he'd be dead. Mark was offered a desk job after that. Too dangerous, they said. Too high profile now. But he refused, because every morning when he woke up and saw Shadow lying by the door, ears twitching, ready to work, he remembered why he became a cop in the first place. To serve, to protect, not just from bullets and thieves, but from rot inside the system. So Mark kept his badge, and Shadow, he got a new one of his own, an honorary K9 badge, presented in front of the entire precinct. Everyone stood when his name was called. Even the chief choked up when Shadow padded up to receive it, tongue out, tail wagging. He was no longer a stray. He was family. They tried to tell Mark it was all luck. That Shadow showing up that night was just coincidence. But Mark knew better. Some dogs are born to chase balls and nap on couches. Others, they're born to save lives. And Shadow, he had waited in silence for years, surviving, suffering, holding on to that one last thread of purpose, until a moment came that demanded everything he had left. And he gave it, without question, without fear, without hesitation, because that's what real heroes do, even the four-legged ones. It was supposed to be just another patrol, a routine check on a lead they'd been quietly building for weeks. The internal affairs team had been closing in on a suspect, one of the key players tied to the warehouse operation Mark and Shadow had uncovered. Mark volunteered to follow up in person. He needed answers, closure. He didn't expect it to turn into a nightmare. The lead took him to the edge of town, an industrial shipping yard long shut down. Half the warehouses now leased to private owners, empty except for one. As Mark pulled up to the gate, he noticed something immediately. The lock had been cut, and the chain was lying on the ground, like an open invitation. Shadow was already tense beside him, body low, ears back. He sensed it too. Something was wrong. Mark stepped inside cautiously, gun drawn, flashlight sweeping the dim space. The warehouse smelled of oil and rust, the kind of damp air that clung to your skin. Shadow stayed close, every step deliberate, every muscle poised. They reached the far corner, empty crates stacked like a wall, and that's what happened. A click, a tripwire. Shadow lunged forward, barking sharply, warning Mark, but it was too late. A flash, a deafening blast of sound. Mark hit the ground hard, ears ringing, his body numb from the concussive force. Smoke filled the room. He couldn't see, couldn't breathe, but he could hear footsteps and Shadow, fighting, snarling, teeth tearing, and then a gunshot. Mark crawled toward the sound, his vision still blurred, lungs burning. He found Shadow sprawled on the floor, a bullet wound in his side, blood pooled beneath him, and the attacker, a masked man, was already fleeing through a side exit. Mark tried to go after him, but Shadow whined, weakly pawing at him. He couldn't leave. He wouldn't. Mark pressed both hands to Shadow's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. No, no, no. Stay with me, buddy. You saved me again. You hear me? You don't get to quit on me now. Shadow's eyes fluttered. His breathing was shallow. But even in that moment dying, he licked Mark's hand, loyal to the very end. Mark carried Shadow in his arms, stumbling out of the warehouse and into the cruiser. No backup, no ambulance, no time. He turned on the siren and flew down back roads, one hand on the wheel, the other on Shadow's blood-soaked fur. Stay awake, boy. Just hold on. Don't leave me. He blew through red lights, swerved around cars, ran the siren until it wailed like a banshee across the city. The vet clinic was 20 minutes away. Mark made it in 9. The vet techs rushed out the second he pulled up. They'd treated Shadow before. Patches of old wounds, infections. But this was life or death. Mark paced outside the operating room, hands shaking, heart thudding. The image of Shadow falling to the ground wouldn't leave his mind. And the guilt, oh God, the guilt. He had walked him into that trap. Again. Shadow had risked everything again, and Mark didn't know if he'd come out alive this time. The vet came out 2 hours later, blood on his gloves, his face unreadable. Mark's knees went weak. Is he? The vet nodded. He's alive. Just barely. The bullet missed his heart by a centimeter. But he's strong. Stronger than most dogs I've seen. He didn't want to go. Mark broke down right there in the waiting room. Shadow had survived. Again. Because some heroes never stop fighting, even when the world tries to take them down. Shadow spent weeks recovering, bandages wrapped tight around his torso, his movements slow, each breath a quiet struggle. But day by day, he got stronger. Mark visited him every morning before his shift, and every night after. He brought treats, toys, and stories, talking like nothing had changed, like everything was okay. Because deep down, Mark knew, if Shadow hadn't been there that day, either day, he wouldn't be around to tell the story. The precinct hailed Shadow a hero. Again, this time, the local news picked it up, a full segment. Stray turned savior, they called it. Reporters camped outside the vet clinic, asking about the bond between man and dog, about how a forgotten stray changed the course of a criminal investigation and saved an officer's life, twice. Mark just smiled and said, "I didn't rescue him, he rescued me." Shadow eventually returned to duty, not as a full-time K9 unit, but as a symbol, a quiet presence at community events, a companion to Mark during long nights on patrol, a reminder that sometimes the most loyal hearts come from the most broken beginnings. People saw him differently now. Kids ran up to pet him. Families asked about adoption, wondering if there were others like Shadow waiting in shelters or roaming the streets. And slowly, the narrative began to change. No longer just a stray, now a hero, a best friend, a living reminder that love, loyalty, and bravery can come from the unlikeliest of places. Want more stories like this? Hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next.